Thank you very much for being here. I will be playing Schubert's Last Piano Sonata for you later tonight, but first, I would like to share with you some thoughts that have informed my understanding of this piece. In comparison with the piano sonatas of Beethoven, the piano sonatas of Schubert are generally not as well known. Even the renowned pianist Daniel Barenboim, who performed all 32 Beethoven sonatas for the first time in 1960 when he was only 18 years old, confesses that he did not pay much attention to the Schubert sonatas for much of his life. His recording of the Schubert sonatas was only released in August 2014. Listeners today are probably more familiar with Schubert's shorter pieces for the piano, such as the impromptus. Traditionally, Schubert's piano sonatas have been criticized for being too long, being unpianistic, and lacking in structural coherence. I believe that these are rather unfair criticisms, and we will address each one of them in an effort to better understand these works. First, with regard to the complaints about the length of Schubert's music, the Hungarian pianist András Schiff scathingly remarks that Schubert's sonatas are not a second too long, it is only certain people's patience that is too short. In the same way, Schumann, who was a great admirer of Schubert, noted the heavenly length of Schubert's Ninth Symphony. Second, unlike Beethoven, Chopin, or Liszt, Schubert was not really a virtuoso pianist. Generally speaking, his piano works do not pose serious technical challenges. One notable exception to this, however, is the Wanderer Fantasy. In playing this piece for his friends at an informal gathering, Schubert reportedly stopped in the middle and simply said, "Let the devil play the stuff." As a pianist, Schubert must have been much more interested in exploring a variety of colors on the piano and making the instrument sing. And with regard to the perceived lack of structural coherence in the Schubert piano sonatas, Alfred Brendel has this to say: "Beethoven composes like an architect, Schubert like a sleepwalker, but we cannot help remembering that sleepwalkers never lose their step." He further explains that for Beethoven, form is the triumph of order over chaos, whereas Schubert's forms are simply a veil of order, which barely conceals the most beautiful chaos music has ever seen. The distinguished British musicologist Sir Donald Francis Tovey believes that to understand Schubert's music, one must realize that key relationships or patterns of modulation are central to his musical thinking. For example, listen to the following excerpt from the Sanctus of Schubert's Mass in E-flat major. Demonstrates Schubert's fondness for chromatic third relations, which can have a disorienting effect. These distantly related harmonies significantly contribute to the beautiful chaos that can make Schubert's music so haunting. How many piano sonatas did Schubert write? This is actually a very complicated question because in addition to complete sonatas, there are also unfinished sonatas as well as fragments. But according to Eva Badura Skoda, there are 20 different piano sonatas of which a performance is meaningful. These 20 sonatas could be divided into three groups. The first group dating from 1815 to 1819, the second group from 1823 to 1826, preceded by the Wanderer Fantasy in 1822, and the third group comprises the last three sonatas, which were all completed in September 1828, just 6 weeks before Schubert died. The early sonatas have long suffered neglect, but in contrast, the last three sonatas are well established in the pianist's repertoire. and the B-flat major sonata in particular is among Schubert's most beloved works. Both Charles Fisk and Alfred Brendel believe that the last three sonatas are closely interrelated. In a lengthy essay, Brendel points out the motivic and tonal connections across the different sonatas, and he further explains that all three sonatas could be understood in the light of the Hegelian triad. A thesis of menace and destructive energy, the C minor sonata, followed by an antithesis of positive luminous activity, the A major sonata, is concluded by a synthesis of resigned composure, the B-flat major sonata. The sonata in C minor has been described as the most neurotic sonata that Schubert ever wrote. The beginning of the work strongly resembles Beethoven's 32 variations in C minor. And here is Schubert's sonata in C minor. Despite its similar harmonic progression in the same key, the character of Schubert's sonata is quite different. In contrast to the tight 8-measure construction of Beethoven's theme, which seems to lend nobility and grandeur to the theme, Schubert's theme struggles anxiously for 20 measures before finding the cadence. The underlying nervous energy of the first movement becomes driven and obsessive in the last movement, which is like a dance of death. The overall mood of the sonata in A major is much more hopeful. Nevertheless, the gloomy second movement in F sharp minor features an alarming descent into madness in its middle section. Here is the start of the movement. The calm melancholy of this opening betrays no hints of the turmoil that emerges in the middle section. That very few composers can probe the darkness of the human condition with such insight as Schubert. In the visual arts, parallels can perhaps be found in the paintings of Goya, such as this one. With stark colors, Goya depicts the mass execution of Spanish citizens who opposed Napoleon's invasion of their country. Like in Schubert's music, civility and decorum are stripped away as the human capacity for violence is revealed with nightmarish intensity. I'm also reminded of the following aphorism by Nietzsche from Beyond Good and Evil. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. I've always found this to be a profoundly disturbing imagery, and my intuition as a performer is that Schubert must have known exactly what this felt like. However, the sonata ends on a decidedly more optimistic note. The finale is most memorable for its warm, lyrical refrain, which conveys to me a feeling of gratitude for simply being alive. In fact, this refrain is a reworking of material from an earlier sonata. This may partly explain its character of innocence, a kind of innocence that paradoxically can only be achieved through experience. Now we come to the B-flat major sonata, which indeed seems to begin where the A major sonata left off. The sonata is cast in 4 movements, opening with a moderately paced first movement in sonata form, followed by a slow movement in C-sharp minor, and then a playful, scintillating scherzo, and finally finishing with a sonata rondo movement that features a striking preoccupation with C minor in its refrain. In the following discussion, I will be focusing mainly on the first movement, but I will note the important details in the other 3 movements as well. Here's the main theme of the first movement. This theme shares some similarities with the opening stanza of a song that Schubert wrote around the same time as this sonata. Am Meer. The original key of the song is C major, but I present it here in B-flat major for easier comparison. The German text, Das Meer erglänzte weit hinaus im letzten Abendscheine, can be translated as, the sea was shining in the last glow of the sunset. Whether this allusion is intentional or not, it is certainly appropriate in evoking the nostalgic and valedictory character of this first movement. In fact, I interpret the movement as a tragic narrative. However, it is far from being melodramatic. We do not encounter a self-pitying protagonist who questions why fate is so cruel to him. Rather, tragic fate is born with dignity and calm resignation. There is a well-known Viennese saying, Die Lage ist hoffnungslos, aber nicht ernst. The situation is hopeless, but not serious. Let's return to the main theme again. The theme has a pastoral character, which is reflected in its peacefulness and simplicity. The simplicity manifests itself in the melody, harmony, and bass line. The melodic line features mainly stepwise motion. Harmonically, we only have tonic, dominant, and subdominant in the first phrase, and the bass line just alternates between B flat and F. If we were to attach a story to these opening measures, we could imagine a protagonist having a perfect, wonderful day. But of course, we all know that nobody really wants to hear a story about someone having a perfect, wonderful day. A truly captivating story should introduce some sort of conflict. So how does Schubert do this? First of all, the phrase ends sooner than it should. We expect asymmetrical 4+4 grouping, but Schubert actually gives us 4+3. This is rather subtle, but the perceptive listener may realize at an intuitive level that something is not quite right. What follows, however, is far from subtle. A chromatic trill in the low register gives a sense of foreboding. We come to realize that the protagonist has a tragic flaw. This trill is truly the source of the dramatic conflict throughout the sonata. In fact, it will remain unresolved until the final page of the last movement. What does the protagonist do to address this problem? For the moment, he simply pretends that nothing is wrong and just starts over again. But ignoring a problem seldom makes it go away. Note that the G-flat to F motion from the trill becomes incorporated into the theme in measure 15 going to measure 16. The perfect authentic cadence in measure 18 sounds so clipped as to be almost apologetic. Another trill in the bass now sends the music to G-flat major, a modulation that signifies lessening tension, perhaps suggesting that the protagonist has retreated inside his protective shell. Eventually emerges from his protective shell with renewed determination. But he still cannot correct his tragic flaw. A deceptive resolution to a diminished 7th chord in measure 45 violently launches the music into F sharp minor. B-flat major to F sharp minor is a chromatic third relation, just like what we have encountered earlier in the Sanctus from Schubert's Mass. The key of F sharp minor may seem unexpected, but it's actually well prepared because the enharmonic equivalent of F sharp is G flat, which has been prominently emphasized in the bass trill from measure 8. In other words, there is some order within chaos. Nevertheless, F sharp minor represents a major setback for our protagonist, and it leaves him in a state of confusion. The subordinate theme initially fluctuates between F sharp minor and A major, and later on between F sharp dominant 7 and A dominant 7. Meanwhile, it's not immediately clear where the melody is. Is it in the soprano? Or perhaps it's in the tenor? Eventually, the protagonist finds his way out of this labyrinth of confusion with a soaring melodic line. After so much wandering, the music finally reaches the dominance as the conventional goal of a sonata exposition in a major key. But still, the dominant is not firmly established. At the end of the exposition, Schubert makes 3 attempts at confirming F major, the dominant, each attempt becoming more convoluted than the last. So up to this point, we could understand the music as portraying a protagonist with a tragic flaw, incapable of acting as convention dictates. Before proceeding to the development section, I would like to discuss the passage that leads back to the repeat of the exposition. This is a curious and controversial passage, primarily because it is the only time in the movement that the bass trill from measure 8 is stated fortissimo. Brendel seems to think that this makes no musical sense and that the performer should avoid playing this passage and the exposition repeat that would follow. On the other hand, Schiff's opinion is that the powerful transformation of the trill here is a stroke of genius and it should not be omitted in performance. As for me, I can recall Francis Bacon writing in his novel Organum that whatever deserves to exist deserves also to be known. So I believe that this passage deserves to be played, and I will leave it to the listener to decide whether or not it's musically convincing. Going into the development section, the music proceeds abruptly from F major to C sharp minor, presenting us with a chromatic third relation that parallels the earlier modulation from B flat major to F sharp minor. However, the effect here is not of violence, but rather alienation. The main theme is now stated in C sharp minor, which will become the key of the second movement. A devastating sense of loss permeates this passage, as if the protagonist's recollection of a happier time is now clouded by dark thoughts. Finding no peace of mind, he begins to wander into remote tonal regions. The right-hand material in measure 131 is derived from the closing theme, while the left hand presents a new motive, which will become quite significant. In measure 151, this motive is transferred to the right hand, now heard against a calmly repeated note in the bass. Then in measure 159, the hands switch their roles. Texture here becomes strikingly reminiscent of the opening measures of another song by Schubert, Der Wanderer. The text of the song describes a silent wanderer who searches in vain for the place where he could be truly happy. I find this to be an appropriate imagery for much of the development section. In my opinion, the retransition is the most hauntingly beautiful passage in the entire sonata. Charles Fisk describes the passage as a no man's land. Suspended in D minor, the main theme reappears, neither earthbound nor stratospheric, but hovering as if transfixed. Then the theme is stated in B flat major, marked triple piano like a faint vision of home. half diminished seventh chord in measure 196 is especially poignant, as the G flat here refers back to the G flat from the prominent bass trill of measure 8, the tragic flaw that has been the cause of so much suffering. The music eventually breaks free from D minor, but this freedom is short-lived, for the melodic line descends inexorably to the tragic flaw itself. I will skip the recapitulation and talk about the coda, where the main theme returns for the last time, appearing now as a mere shadow of its former self. Rather than an expansive, flowing melody, we now hear isolated, self-enclosed turn figures. And a turn figure is just a step away from becoming a trill. This is exactly what happens in measure 352. It is significant that the first movement concludes with the tragic flaw, which still remains to be overcome. The second movement is a lament in C sharp minor. Cast in ternary form, section A presents the melody in the middle range, surrounded by a pointillistic commentary. The stillness here is all-pervasive, the sense of loneliness profound. Incidentally, this kind of texture is somewhat similar to the opening of the slow movement of Schubert's String Quintet. Section B is in A major, and it has been poetically described as the sunrise that never comes. This material actually harks back to the main theme from the first movement of the A major sonata. Here is a reduction of the first 5 measures. Note the motion by parallel thirds. Inverting these parallel thirds gives us parallel 6, and the connection to section B from the second movement of the B flat major sonata becomes more evident. There is also a reference back to the first movement of the sonata itself in the deceptive resolution to the diminished 7th chord in measure 66, which parallels measure 45 in the first movement. The return of section A features a more rhythmically active ostinato in the bass, which perhaps serves to remind the listener of the ominous trill from the first movement. But by far the most remarkable passage in the second movement is the unexpected turn to C major in measure 103, which is a spellbinding moment that foreshadows the ending of the movement in C sharp major. Let me play for you from here. The third movement is a charming scherzo with a dizzying whirlwind of harmonic changes. Here's how it begins. Though generally light-hearted, this scherzo nevertheless contains a few hints of unease, notably the brief F sharp minor in measure 50, which looks back to the shocking modulation to F sharp minor in the first movement. I'll play for you from there. The finale is the only movement in this sonata that does not begin pianissimo. An octave G ushers in a graceful, energetic movement that offers the long-anticipated resolution to the conflict that was presented in the first movement. Curiously, this opening material, which is the catchy refrain of the sonata rondo movement, bears some resemblance to the opening of another work by Schubert. This is the impromptu in C minor. Therefore, there is an arresting digressive preoccupation with C minor in this movement, a preoccupation that is nonetheless more playful than subversive. The finale of Schubert's B-flat major sonata features several dramatic moments. For instance, in measure 156, Schubert presents an assertive theme in F minor, which heavily emphasizes the Neapolitan harmony. Appassionata moment, because Schubert seems to be synthesizing ideas from the first and last movements of the Appassionata by Beethoven. The last page of the sonata provides the successful resolution of the main conflict of the entire work, namely the G-flat to F motion from the bass trill of the first movement. First, Schubert deliberately calls the listener's attention to G-flat and F in a passage that transforms the playful digressive elements from the refrain into a serious question. Let me play from there. Presto coda, all worries are dispelled as the problematic G-flat that has the strong tendency to fall to F is now negated by an F sharp that rises to G natural in a gesture that could be portraying the protagonist finally overcoming the tragic flaw that has plagued him for so long. I hope very much that this presentation on Schubert's last piano sonata has been informative. I look forward very much to playing this piece for you after the intermission.